Pulsar Studio.
Video games are the youngest artistic medium, and since their emergence, they have managed to create surprising worlds and experiences inspired by reality and using symbols to represent it. This is Checkpoint, and today we are going to discover an example of how they do it. Video games are a medium with virtually infinite possibilities to create worlds, tell stories, and express any type of idea or reflection, thanks to the fact that it is a medium that uses different forms of art as a tool, and combines them in an interactive system in which it is not just the expression of the creator that matters, but also the contribution of those who experience and interact with the work. Hideo Kojima is one of the most famous creators in the industry, due to the relevance and quality of the titles he has created, and for the impact and contribution of his work towards other creators in the medium, as well as players. One of the reasons that makes Kojima so effective in his craft is his great capacity for observation and perception of the world that surrounds him, as well as a very marked emotional sensibility and an ability to channel these qualities into creative energy. Death Stranding is a world that was born as Kojima's first independent creation after 30 years of relationship with Konami, where he had expressed all his creative potential until that moment. This title is an extraordinary example of how to create a complete world from the symbols and metaphors that reflect the interpretation of reality of those who conceive it. Like every artistic and creative person, each work that Kojima creates is not product of a specific moment, but has been gestated in his mind over the years, taking up ideas and resources that he has used before and giving them a new meaning. However, Death Stranding is also a very crude reflection of the moment he was going through. As he has told in different interviews, after leaving what was his home for decades, Kojima felt alone and empty, isolated from the rest of the world with nothing around. He had also been feeling and perceiving for some time that the society in which we live is in a state of digital hyperconnectivity as a result of internet and social media, but at the same time in an acute state of personal disconnection. Loneliness is a feeling that is not uncommon for us video games lovers, who many times feel as we do not fit into society, simply because what we are passionate about is not understood or accepted by the majority. And this is something that also served as a fuel for inspiration for this new work. It is from his feeling and perception of reality that the premise and vision of the game was born, and the world created. In Death Stranding, the world is both a reflection of that loneliness and isolation that we live in, and a personal projection of where Kojima thinks the world will lead if it continues on this path. Hideo represents this through a post-apocalyptic setting in which a cosmic and natural event puts civilization on the brink of extinction, taking the few survivors sheltered in underground bunkers and isolated from each other. The feeling and state of loneliness is reflected in the protagonist, Sam Porter, who, following the symbology to create the universe, lives up to his name by being a delivery man in a context in which his tasks become one worthy of heroes since the survival of the species depends on its deliveries. The hope and salvation of the human species clings to reconnecting the surviving communities in a lasting way, creating a knot in each connection and forming a massive network once all the knots have been connected. This is the mission of Sam and the player. The event that led to the apocalypse left the surface of the world plagued by ghostly beings that upon perceiving a human being will chase him until they consume him and create an explosion. These ghosts, known in the game as BTs, represent the state of death stranded to which society is directed in Kojima's mind, a product of isolation and disconnection between people. The game is an entire orchestra of symbology in which each feeling or concept has a figurative meaning and also a literal meaning when represented through a mechanic. What remains of the United States of America as an organization is called Bridges, referring to a bridge that seeks to unite, and to achieve this mission, they entrust Sam Porter with the task asking him to carry objects between bunker cities, which are called knots, in addition to connecting them through a network. The constant thread is that Death Stranded, which makes a game with the word strand because it can also mean thread, which is a tool that has the ability to join two points by a means of a knot. One of the ways in which ghostly beings manifest is in the form of whales, which in real life suffer a tragic event in which they are stranded on the beach at low tide, fighting against the clock to return to the sea or die suffocated, being also a metaphor for that death stranded that humanity faces. BTs are a representation of the death stranded, where a human being died but was stuck in a state of antimatter, and paradoxically, the presence of these beings generates a special rain that, when in contact with matter, dramatically accelerates the passage of time in it. All the characters also have their own representation of death and their own way of stranding, from not being able to die, being characters born from death, having died and having been trapped in the consequence of that event, or dying constantly every 21 minutes. Having the setting that serves to represent loneliness and disconnection from the world, the mechanics set in. And this is where Kojima and his team achieve something very interesting, because they create a very novel experience from almost literal representation of those concepts. The game is an open world, where the surface of it is of incredible beauty thanks to the absence of man and the slow disappearance of the traces that were left after he stepped through the world. But also where the infrastructure for moving easily from one point to another is no more, and moving around is much greater challenge, in addition to having the constant danger of BDs lurking everywhere. Being a courier, Sam must carry objects to be delivered to each bunker or not, and this is literally represented in a game mechanic. The main mechanic of the game is to load the objects in Sam's body, where the capacity of load that the character has for carrying and transporting objects from one point to another is limited, and the overload will make the movement much more difficult or even impossible. The missions consist of carrying vital objects such as food, medicine, tools to keep the survivors alive and preserve the few remains of civilization. But the amount to be delivered is almost always greater than the load capacity that Sam has, so the player must decide and organize the loads and trips, in addition to leaning on tools and unlockable objects with the progress of the adventure, giving it a bigger depth and greater sense to set mechanics. The terrain and the BTs will always be an obstacle, but the player will always want to deliver as much cargo as possible, so not to repeat the trip many times due to the challenge it represents. And this is where the interaction of the mechanics and the setting comes in play, to kick off the experience, because the player is given the tools to decide and act taking into account the context of the world and the narrative in which they are immersed. Each connected node and mission completed will help to get improvements such as greater capacity, items to defend against BTs, or the groups of radicals that remain in the world. Having vehicles and artifacts that help to move throughout the world with greater ease and being able to carry more objects. In addition, the setting and context give a narrative sense to the importance of completing the deliveries, making the player feel that their work really matters and is serving to save humanity and reconnect the isolated and desolated world. The player is in a constant dynamic of hardship and care, giving meaning to the activity that is carried out and perfectly representing loneliness and vulnerability, feeling the weight of the responsibility to keep his own species alive. It is in this dynamic where Kojima brilliantly introduces another metaphor that alludes to the condition of virtual connectivity that initially served as one of the inspirations of the game. The game has a passive or indirect connectivity between players, similar to what From Software uses in its games. Each player finds herself in her own isolated world. However, she can also create a bond with other players who are living the experience in their own world, by leaving objects, constructions, or messages that are always available in all worlds for those who travel through the same places. Each player can help the others by leaving objects such as ladders, ropes, or bridges to cross difficult areas. When a player uses an item that another player left behind, whoever left the item will be rewarded with recovering stamina and increasing their rank. In addition, it is possible to give a like to the objects or messages of the players, which generates the same effect, proposing a positive way in which that connectivity and interaction acquire a positive sense of gratitude and solidarity, key elements for truthful human connection. It is difficult to explain the game based on its mechanics and systems, because there are no similar experiences, and it is difficult to describe in words how is that, when placed in the hands of the players, They managed to represent something as profound as loneliness, but Kojima's and his team's passion made the design of these mechanics and systems really generate a unique experience. This game is packed with examples where Kojima's teams create gameplay and tells a story using metaphors and symbology. And while every interactive experience makes use of symbology and metaphors, few works have taken this exercise to such a tangible and literal sense as Death Stranding have. And you? What other great, unique experiences have you lived that make use of symbology and metaphors? Leave it in the comments below. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Checkpoint. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this to keep discovering the art in making and designing video games. See you next time.